offer and acceptance. Now, again, as I mentioned before, is Chapter 13 is your big dog here, introduces you to a lot of these terms. Then most of the rest of this module, up to Chapter 20, just takes little pieces that we've talked about in Chapter 13 and expands them and gives you a lot more detail about these concepts. And so let's take a look at offer and acceptance. Now, again, one of my principles here is, as business people, we ought not to be wondering if we've got offer and acceptance. We should be dealing with good paperwork that's been prepared by our company attorneys or our outside counsel. We should be consistent in our utilization of those contracts. People in the field should not be allowed to modify the contracts. Another problem is you can write the world's best contract, but if the people in the field are out there, scratching pieces of the contract out without getting proper legal support, you can create errors like that. So it's something to keep in mind. One of my simple examples of this was I, over the years, have written many independent contractor agreements for small businesses. And some years ago, a very long-time client of mine came to me and said, hey, I'd like to get you to revise our independent contractor agreement. Here's our current one, and implying that I had written it for them. And they sent me their so-called current independent contractor agreement, and it was a disaster. It was a total mess. And I said to them, I said, this is not my contract. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, you prepared this for us like 10 years ago. I was like, no. I may have written an independent contractor agreement for you 10 years ago, but this wasn't the one. Somebody has messed around with this to make it unrecognizable, and it's somebody who was not an attorney, because there's certain ways that attorneys write and construct contracts, and that was not incorporated in the agreement that these folks sent to me. So somebody had fooled around with the document to try and so-called customize it, and oftentimes that's done by small businesses simply to avoid legal fees. They're like, well, we don't want to pay our attorney an extra $200 or $400 or whatever, so we're just going to go ahead and make this change. It's not going to hurt anything and all that. And then when they get into a lack of performance and they're trying to enforce it, they bring it to their attorney, and the attorney says, hey, you crossed out something that's really critical to this agreement. So again, the moral to the story is use good agreements, and then do not let people in the field fool with the agreements. Make sure if there are any modifications that they are done through counsel or at least through senior management. And again, part of that may be that as times change, contracts can get out of date. So if the contract gets out of date, you want to bring it back to your counsel to have them make revisions and update the agreements to the current day. So that, just some things to think about there. So we're going to look at offers and acceptance. One of the things that we've even mentioned earlier in the course, and again, I want to point this out when you've got this hot link here, is as you go through these slides, there are additional resources available from the textbook publisher. And if you've purchased any type of software, and of course today most of this is done online, you cannot access the software until you engage in the CLICWRAP agreement. Now, in most cases, these CLICWRAP agreements are considered binding unless there's a state law that prohibits it. And they do have to comply with certain basic terms, but overall, basically what it says is, we're not responsible for anything. We're not responsible for these things tearing up your computer or having viruses in them and all that. The worst that you can do to us is to get your money back. You cannot get any consequential or punitive damages or all that, things that we've already talked about. And so it says objective theory of contracts, you have to have an agreement, which we talked about right at the beginning of chapter 13. So one of the things is we need to control a variety of situations that are in a contract. We want somebody to do something we want somebody to not do something, or we want somebody to do both, do something or refrain from doing something. And this is intended to be current obligation. And again, another hot link here from the publisher. So what's a quick way of evaluating contracts? Right here. Present intention to contract, not later but now. Reasonably definite terms. Again, I like terms to be real definite. And you need to have the communication of the offer to the party that has the authority to accept the offer on the other side. Courts will supply a reasonable time for performance. If there's a standard in the industry, that's what they'll enforce. If there's no price specified, a court can rule the standard price for that item in the community. Now, if the contract has an incorporation clause, the courts cannot fix it. So a lot of it depends on how the contract is worded, whether the courts can make it better. One of the most entertaining cases that you're going to see in the whole textbook is Leonard versus PepsiCo. PepsiCo is a pretty fascinating case. Here's what happened. And PepsiCo, this is a good 20 years ago, says, hey, if you bring in 1 million bottle caps or pull tabs from our soda cans, we're going to give you a Harrier fighter jet. This was meant to be fanciful. It wasn't meant to be a real deal. And how do we know that? Well, first of all, a civilian cannot buy a Harrier fighter jet, that you cannot own one. You might be able to get a World War II Hellcat jet and have it out there in the Harlingen Air Force demonstration. But other than that, you're not going to be able to take one home is the short version. So that was, right for starters. But what these people did is there was an exception in the rules that said, if you have at least 12 bottle caps, you can make up the rest in cash. And for the top prize, it was $1 million in cash and 12 bottle caps. So these clowns led by Leonard went in and offered the $1 million in 12 bottle caps and said, we're ready for that fighter jet. And of course, the PepsiCo said, no, that's a joke. You guys can't get a fighter jet. So they actually ended up in court, and the court agreed with PepsiCo. And in fact, I think awarded them legal fees and said this was so outrageous that there's no remedy except for PepsiCo has the right to remedy, because they had to incur a lot more legal fees because of the silliness from the Leonard side. So when we're running advertisements, sometimes the question becomes whether there's an offer. Basically, these kinds of things are not hard offers. Now, that can be different. If I get a proposal to put a new tile floor in one of my rental units and they say, we're providing this estimate, you can accept it by signing here, that's pretty much a hard offer. That's not just a proposal, it's a hard offer. And I've been doing some real estate issues lately on my own real estate, and I've had to do that where somebody said, hey, we're going to go in and do this and this and this. Here's our contract. And it looks like a proposal, but you can accept it simply by signing it or even just emailing them back. So keep in mind, a lot of this stuff is not intended to be an enforceable contract, but it's going to be case by case. Most of you, I usually poll my classes, and many students have been to one auction or a different kind. If you've been to any charity events, it's very common to have a silent auction or a silent auction plus a live auction. The last auction I went to was in the fall, was a charity auction, and they raised funds by selling stuff at both the silent auction and the live auction, generated some nice funds for the charity. And the question that comes up is reserve versus without reserve. So if you have something that's extremely valuable, like a antique painting, again, perhaps a Van Gogh, you want to make sure that if the auction is poorly attended, you don't inadvertently sell a $30 million painting for $20 million. So what you may do is put in a reserve to say, we will only sell this painting for a minimum of $27 million. That's the reserve. And then we're hoping to get up to 40 million. And Van Gogh's recently, several of them have sold upwards of $40 million. So that's not an unreasonable number. But again, you're risking it without reserve auction is that the thing could sell very cheap if people do not vigorously bid on it. Now, again, the issue of duration comes up. You'll notice that in many advertisements on television, one of the things they'll say is this offer is good until September 9th. It's our Labor Day promotion and it ends September 9th. And then a lot of times they'll run that ad and say, oh, big huzzah, Gallery Furniture, we're going to extend our Labor Day promotion through the next weekend. And it's now going to end on the 14th. Well, they're certainly entitled to do it, but it is important to indicate expiration dates and they must be reasonable. So apparently there were some car sellers who would say, hey, look at this terrific F-150 truck in this beautiful, we're going to sell it for $12,000. So everybody would run down there and it turns out there was one truck for sale for $12,000 and the rest of them were for sale for $25,000. And so a lot of people got hacked off. So basically, if you set up a particular advertising program, there has to be, especially when you're offering it to consumers, there has to be a reasonable time to act on that opportunity. I also want to point out the impact of a counteroffer under common law. And so I'm willing to sell you my car and you come to me and you say, this is kind of a nice, clean, used car. I'll give you $5,000 for it. And I say, well, I'm willing to sell it to you for $5,000. Okay, you have a deal. But suppose you say to me, you're asking $5,000 for that vehicle, but I really think it needs new tires. I'll give you $5,000 for it, but you have to put a new set of Michelin tires on it for $600-700. Well, you've just changed the whole dynamic of the deal, and that's a counteroffer. That's not mirror for mirror from the original offer. So you need to be careful about that because that invites the other side to walk the deal. So if you really want the deal, you've got to be careful with regard to a counteroffer. And part of the issue becomes, when is an offer irrevocable? First of all, very few offers are irrevocable over the long term. But certain states and the federal government do require businesses, in many cases, commercial businesses, like, as we mentioned, auto dealerships already, that they need to have the product, the automobiles, on offer for some reasonable period of time. They can't just say, hey, we've got this fabulous sale from, midnight to 4 a.m. tonight. We'll sell you a car if you're willing to get out of bed and go without sleep. So those things are not generally permitted. Many of you are familiar that in real estate, an option is very valuable. So a lot of businesses option a property, they make a purchase, and they say, if this property can carry our business, we're going to go ahead and buy it. But it's not a binding contract until they're done doing their due diligence. I was involved in a $10 million real estate transaction inside the loop a few years ago. And it was option because with a purchase that large, the buyers wanted to make sure that they could use the existing property for certain other businesses, and they need to make sure that there was no environmental problems with the real estate. They also wanted to make sure there were no restrictions on that area that would prevent them from building something larger on the same site, utilizing the piece of real estate more effectively. So that's some of the things that we saw in that deal. But again, it was all about the options. It really wasn't about an actual purchase contract, and that deal did go through. Now, again, we've been under the common law. We've been talking about contracts under the common law, but we're now going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about what happens under the Uniform Commercial Code. And this is going to be Article 2-205. And so if a merchant makes an offer, it's irrevocable for a reasonable period of time. And it needs to be for the sale of goods, so it'll come under Article 2. But it cannot be under the offer must be involving the sale of goods must be for no longer than 3 months. So you do have a limitation. Now, again, most of the time, these sales of goods are for much shorter periods of time, but they cannot be an illusion. They have to be a reasonable period of time for a reasonable buyer to get in there, make a decision, and make the purchase before the price changes. They also have to, there's some more technical aspects to this. You have to actually have the merchandise available. Now, that's a big deal today because you may go to buy something and find out that the store is been not just out of it, but been completely out of it for a while and do not know when they're going to get that product back in. Now, the flip side of offer is acceptance. So the later part of this chapter talks about the acceptance. Now, one of the more complex pieces to this is acceptance by what mechanism? So we do a lot of stuff by email today. We don't do nearly as much by fax. Now, one of the things that looks like email but has replaced fax, and some of you, if you've done a real estate deal in the last couple of years, know what I'm talking about, something called DocuSign. So what happens is that a real estate deal is put together, everybody agrees on the phone. The real estate, one of the agents then prepares a DocuSign document, gets their clients to sign it, emails it to the other broker. The other broker sends it to his or her client and says, hey, we need you to sign this contract. And you go in online and sign it and accept it or make a counteroffer. So that's the way that kind of works. In the past, in the old days, they exchanged faxes. Faxes are largely dead. They're mostly harassment today. And in fact, I actually have a class action lawsuit pending in the Southern District of Texas against the junk fax generators to see if we can shut down that scourge of operations. And no, Dr. Schein does not have a fax machine anymore, but I have been receiving random faxes as recently as this morning on my cell phone. And they're completely unauthorized, but to try and shut it down, we started collecting them and actually found an attorney who's interested in making a federal lawsuit out of it. So we talked about an act being an acceptance and a unilateral offer. Again, we don't like that. That's an oddball situation. Promise for promise, that's a standard contract. And then, and of course, the delivery of the instrument, as I mentioned, that could be through DocuSign, email, scanning and emailing and so forth, lots of stuff. Now, one of the things is that when you have an LLC, an Inc., or a partnership, you need to know who has the authority to enter into the offer. As business people, we want to make sure that we're dealing with the real people here and not dealing with somebody who cannot complete the deal. So again, the offer should indicate how it can be accepted. Again, we don't like people calling each other on the phone. You might call somebody on the phone and say, yes, or I'm going to do the deal. I recently was selling a piece of real estate and it was done through DocuSign. And what I did is I executed the contract through DocuSign, but then sent an email to my real estate broker and said, hey, I have signed this, we're ready to go on the deal. Or if I needed a counteroffer, I would call and say, hey, I can't sign the DocuSign because there are some terms that I'm not comfortable with, and then we'd negotiate that out. So remember, one of the things that we talked about is the mirror image rule. So in common law, a mirror image rule means a counteroffer unless it is an exact duplicate of the prior offer. And again, that's if there's 5 points in the contract, 5 points in the acceptance, 100% on board, mirror image. Now, the Uniform Commercial Code. So for sales of goods over $500 across state lines, UCC says mirror image rule. Now we're okay with adding or subtracting different terms unless they're so material that it changes the whole output of the deal. So this is fairly dangerous under the Uniform Commercial Code. Now, remember that when you're the person making the offer, you can tell the other side how you want acceptance. So you can say, well, you can send us a letter. Hardly anybody does that today. Usually you may say you can send a scanned copy by email tonight, and then if it's a big deal, FedEx us the hard copy immediately so we'll get it the next day or two. So that's pretty common today. So again, they come back to unilateral offer, something that, again, I do not like, but substantial performance constitutes an acceptance. And this is where you've accepted a big part of an order, but you've never signed the PO or anything like that, but you've accepted the goods and started using them. And again, a lot of different circumstances may be under consideration, including if something is highly perishable.